All right, so we're fortunate today to be here with speaking with Laury Scott, the former president and managing director of Radofin, the creator of our beloved Aquarius. We're going to discuss the history and significance of Radofin Electronics as told by Laury Scott and gain a better understanding of how the organization came about, its impact in the industry, and its legacy moving forward. Again, I'd like to be able to document this somewhere. When you want to be able to add things into Wikipedia, they want you to cite something, and now they're allowing people to cite YouTube videos, which is a good source. So I think this will dispel a lot of the myths that have swirled around, what did or didn't happen. And then also to understand the significance of Radofin. Radofin was a silent player because of the way it was positioned in the industry. It was a brand, but it was a lot more than that. Hopefully, we'll gain some insight into Aquarius, what it was and what it wasn't. So, Laury, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm not sure where to start. When I was young, my parents moved around a lot, and I was born in San Francisco. Moved to Hawaii, then Japan, back to San Francisco, and I did sixth grade through high school in Marin County, which is what really I consider home. I went off to college. After that, began working and did most of my working outside the United States. So I worked in Europe, I worked in Asia. I will get into a lot of the details as we go forward.
So what was your first experience with digital electronics? We've always had electric toys.
Yes.
In the early 70s, we started to get these great digital toys. So what was your first experience with those?
My first digital experience was probably in grad school when we had to program in Fortran 4. So that was my first real, I guess, my first real experience working with computers. That they don't like us calling them IBM cards, but we programmed it with IBM cards, and that was my first experience. In terms of consumer electronics,
yeah,
my dad imported the first Sony radios into the United States in 1956. He was in the business, so I was just, we were always involved in consumer electronics.
You mentioned college. Tell us a little about what USC was like mid 60s to late 60s when you were there.
Okay. Well, I mean, USC was still a large school in those days. If I remember correctly, it was something like 30,000 students. I'm sure it's a lot more today. It was really a commuter school in the sense that a lot of the people who were going there came from the LA area. And so they would go home for weekends or they lived at home and came to school. It was a sports school. When in the 1962 Olympics, USC would have finished fifth or sixth or something like that. So it was very much sports-oriented school. I had a great school. I started out in engineering my first year. I didn't belong there, but that's what my dad suggested I do. Almost flunked out of school, and then switched over to a business major and ended up graduating in '68 with honors. Going back in 1969, having worked for a year, and got my MBA.
You're a U.S. citizen. What languages do you speak?
English, a little bit of Japanese, a little bit of German, and a few words of Chinese.
Rather than maybe going through the specifics on these questions that we have on the screen, let's just have you tell it how Radofin became.
As I said, I'm just back up a little bit. My father imported the first Sony radios into the United States in 1956, 57. Unbeknownst to Sony, he was fluent in Japanese. It was very common, and still is, for the Japanese to talk in front of you, figuring you don't know what they're talking about. He was a one-man company and realized that they were looking for alternative method of sales. And so he beat them to the punch. He found another company in Japan, which I think was a predecessor of Akai. And they made radios for him. And then as the prices went down, he opened the second radio factory in Hong Kong in the late 50s. And then in 1962, he picked up a case of acute infectious hepatitis in the Far East, and he was in bed for 9 months, and the doctors told him he'd never work again. And he moved to Europe, to Rome at first, as kind of an enforced retirement. And his health came back, and so he wanted to work again and began doing the business that he knew, which was the consumer electronic radio business. And for tax reasons, set up a company in Liechtenstein to finance the radio business, and that became Radofin.
So Radofin is radio finance.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
interesting. Let's go on with how we made the jump from radios onto a broader set of consumer electronics.
Okay. 1968, I graduated in January. I went to Europe and I worked for my father, primarily doing sales. And the vision that my father had was he had very good contacts in the Far East in the audio business, in the consumer electronic business, and found a niche for himself. The European buyers were relatively small compared to the US buyers. So he was able to go to the factories and take the same model that they were selling to the US companies and take it for Europe. So we had importers which we sold to in most of the European countries, and in some cases there were multiple importers in a given country, and we sold them exclusive models, and that business grew to the factories. We looked like kind of a small US company who were buying in the tens of thousands of products. And to the European importers, we looked like a factory. So it was a good niche business. That ran on for 10 months, 11 months. And as oftentimes happens, my father and I didn't see eye to eye on everything. And I ended up going back to USC and got my master's degree. I then went to work for Bank of America for a year and a half. And my father's health declined again, and I moved back to Europe to help out. And that's when we started to really grow the company. We broadened the range from just radios. We moved into cassette recorders, clock radios, low-end stereo. I think it was in the early 70s, 72, 73. We were the largest importer of cassette recorders into Europe, more than Philips, who designed them in the first place. And that business, we were selling to importers in each country, sometimes under their private label brand. Sometimes they wanted us to come up with a brand for them, which is where we came out first with the name Triton, then the name Manta, which were just generic brands for us. And we also would stock product in our brand, even though it was the same product they were selling in their country, so that when they needed it for sales, they could pull right out of our stock. In 1974, we introduced a new product line, handheld calculator, and it went very, very well, but we could only get very limited quantities. We were having them made for us by a company in the UK who was struggling. So we signed a contract. Well, I think it was 73 we started the calculator. 74 we signed a contract with Electronics out of the United States, who had introduced a low-end four-function calculator. They could not deliver enough, but we sold a lot of calculators, decided to do the same thing and have calculators built for us in Asia, which we would sell in Europe. At one point in time, we're buying from, I think, 4 different factories, but we couldn't get enough. In the early days of calculators, everything was short. Demand was high, and it was difficult to get the chips, difficult to get the displays. And so we decided to open up our own factory in Hong Kong. And in 1975, opened up our first factory in Hong Kong. Now, at that point in time, the company consisted of a number of different companies, most bearing the Radofin name. There was Radofin ETS, which was ETS is short for Etablissement, which is French, which is the Liechtenstein holding company. There was Radofin Electronics Far East. There was Radofin Electronics UK. And later there was a Radofin Electronics US. And so we started the factory in Hong Kong. I was primarily doing sales in Europe, and we hired someone that didn't work out, and we realized we needed to have someone on the spot. And so I went to Hong Kong and opened the factory and learned manufacturing by being thrown in the deep end. And so we opened the first factory in 75, building calculators. We followed the same business model. We were selling them under our name. We added the Radofin name into the calculator line, and also under our customers' names. Our largest buyer at the time was Radio Shack. We were selling a lot of calculators to Radio Shack.
Was Radofin manufacturing the displays, or was it a part that they got the source from somebody else?
No, we were an assembler.
Okay.
We
Gotcha.
bought displays, chips, and assembled them into the finished calculators. We had a full range of calculators, from simple 4-function, 5-function calculators up to scientific calculators. And we used chips that were developed by different companies. Our major supplier of chips was a company called General Instruments.
Yeah,
who were based in Hicksville, New York. We were really an OEM company. That was our goal. We were not trying to develop our own product lines and distribute our own brand, but we were developing product lines which we sold to importers. We had some radios. We were still selling calculators, going very well. And in the 76 time, maybe, General Instruments announced that they were going to develop a high-end video game system, because the initial video games were all basically Pong-style games, 4 or 6 games, tennis and soccer and shooting games. And they were working on this, and we had quite a close relationship with GI because we were one of their major outlets for their chips, for calculators, and then video games as they went into that business, the low-end business. They started working with Mattel. Mattel expressed an interest, and they signed a contract, and they were going to develop this high-end video game system for the product that became Intellivision. And GI had troubles getting it going. And then the first year, Mattel decided they wanted to have it made in the US because they wanted to have the ability to get their people there on hours' notice. And so they were working with GTE Sylvania in Muncie, Pennsylvania, and that wasn't working out. We received an introduction to Mattel initially through GI and began conversations. At the time, they were thinking of possibly building it in Asia, possibly building it with GT Sylvania. And so we started a business relationship with Mattel, and we produced 2 of their handheld games, Football 2 and the auto racing game for them. We were the sole manufacturer of Football 2, which was late 70s. And as I said, the Intellivision production at GT Sylvania was not going very smoothly. And so they decided to move it out the following year to Asia and contracted with us to build Intellivision for them. Intellivision was very difficult to build in the early days, primarily because the quality of the GI chips wasn't that good. We were basically having to run in every game for 24 hours and then testing it before we shipped it. From memory, there were 10 to 15% defective was common, and we had lots that were 40 to 50% defective. And so we struggled to build as well, but we did build and we got them out. Mattel knew nothing about Europe, and so they asked us to design a PAL version of the game. So we initially, using external parts, did a PAL version of the game, and then later GI produced a PAL version of the video chip. And so that's how we got really involved with Mattel. And as the business went on, and we were doing all of their Intellivision production, and as it was growing, they opened up their own factory in Hong Kong to build Intellivision. And so we were both building Intellivision. And as I said, we were an OEM company and always developing products on our own. And we came up with a concept for a simple home computer. And that product initially had a project name of Checkers, with a step-up version to follow called Chess. And we brought this to Mattel's attention, and Mattel was interested in the product. And so we started working with them on this home computer.
One of the myths that goes out there is that the failure of the ECS module, which had been promised in early marketing by Mattel, prompted FTC to kind of start sniffing around and say, hey, where's this computer module that you had promised for this? Was Mattel interested because they were trying to fill that void, or was it they had always planned on having some sort of a home computer system?
Well, the answer, maybe, I don't really know, maybe a little bit of both. I don't think it was related to the inability to produce the computer module that was going to go with Intellivision. We actually built a few of them, but it wasn't a very good design. It didn't go together very well. It was extremely difficult, and it was expensive. So the idea of a low-end computer, a low-end home computer, was very attractive to them, and they saw it as an evolutionary step from the video game into a low-end computer, and that low-end computer would have to have gaming capability.
Was your brother involved in the company at all? I think it's Ken, right?
Ken. My brother he joined the company in late 60s, maybe 1970. Initially, he went to Hong Kong and managed the Hong Kong office because we were buying all of our consumer electronic product there. So he was working with the manufacturers, running a trading office. Then when we decided to open a factory, he came back to the UK, and then I ended up going to Hong Kong. Ken was involved with Initially sales in the UK, then some sales in Europe, but mostly the UK. And later, when we opened up the US office, he was involved in the US side as well.
In general, how would you compare Radofin as a company in 76 versus where it was in 86, which is a couple years after the home entertainment market crash?
I do not remember the sales numbers. Radofin in the 70s was mostly selling in Europe, but beginning to sell a few products in the United States. By the mid 80s, we were selling our products worldwide. Obviously, Europe was still a major base for us. Also selling direct to retailers in the United States. And manufacturing capacity in 76, we had a single factory in Hong Kong, about 1,500 people. By the mid 80s, we had a large, well, let me back up. We started with one factory in Hong Kong, then expanded to two factories in Hong Kong, two facilities, then combined the two into a larger facility. That was about 110,000 square feet. Hong Kong is a vertical city, as you may know, and it was an 11-story building, and we ran a factory out of that 11-story building. A lot of our American buyers were surprised by this, couldn't understand it, but it actually worked out very well. The only difficult part was the logistics of moving things around this building. But we had large freight elevators, and we had warehouses on some floors. We had 4 floors of finished product assembly, 1 floor of printed circuit board assembly, and the top floor was the office. So it worked out pretty well. By the mid 80s, we had opened an additional factory in China for reasons of primarily labor and costs. Number one, labor in Hong Kong just dried up over the years. And number two, they got much more expensive. So we opened a facility in China.
And was that as a result of the transition to the special tax zone?
We actually opened up a first factory in China. In a way, I guess we'll come back to it and get ahead of ourselves. But Mattel was forecasting huge production numbers for Intellivision and Aquarius. And so we opened up a facility in a tax-free zone, which initially was one of the few places you could open a factory, and built a very nice single-story building factory, more an American-style factory in the zone, and that was in 83, maybe 84. It was open just in time for the crash, and so we didn't use it. And we ended up selling that factory and opening another factory further in China, in not a tax-free zone, just in Guangdong province. And so the last question on your slide is well, 2 questions. Manufacturing capacity, very difficult to measure manufacturing capacity because there's different amounts of labor that go into any product. And I guess, I don't remember the numbers. We could probably talk in terms of man hours of production. But we moved from the single factory, 110,000 square feet, to 2 factories. The China factory was almost similar in size, so we had double the manufacturing capacity in terms of floor space. By the 80s, we were beginning to put in automation in China as well. And so we were doing automatic insertion and some specialized tests that were necessary. And in terms of employees, in 76, it was probably around 2,000 people. And in 86, it was probably double that.
So in all of your years at Radofin, what products are you most proud of? Were there any that disappointed you? As an OEM, that kind of doesn't matter because if the company wants it, we'll sell them whatever they want. And if you could send yourself a note to your 1975 person, what would you say?
So I think that we definitely developed a lot of products. We developed products for our customers. In some cases, they brought us a design. In other cases, they asked us to design something for them. The products I am most proud of at Radofin, I think the Telesports video game, the first one, was extremely difficult in the early days. You had very strict FCC regulations, trying to get it all to work.
And wrap it in tinfoil, basically.
Yeah, getting this product out to market in a timely fashion. And so I'm really proud of that. I don't know if you remember a product line called Captain Power that Mattel sold. This was a TV interactive game. The US TV system works at 60 cycles. Yeah. And by using 60 cycles or 120 cycles, you could produce an image with a photocell, picked up the image. And so you could gain points, gain power, health, or you could shoot enemies we developed these very futuristic looking fighter jets that turned in the shape of a pistol. And Mattel produced a TV show around it. Very difficult to produce because they decided that Mattel has quite severe drop test requirements. And because these were in the shape of jets, they would be thrown or flown. And so initially they were giving us a 5-foot safety drop that couldn't break from a 5-foot drop. And we got it into production and produced a lot, and I was very proud of that. And then as we got into the more technical side, we were producing calculators for an Italian company, Olivetti. And Olivetti had a dot matrix printer mechanism that went into all of their office product calculators. And as we were producing calculators for them, they asked us to produce this printer mechanism, which was something entirely new for us, an electromechanical assembly. And we ended up producing 900,000 pieces a year for them. So I was quite proud of that. What products disappointed me? I think the one that disappointed me the most was we tried to build a fax machine in the late 80s, the brand new product fax machine. They were expensive and we were trying to do it. We thought we had the mechanical know-how from the printer mechanism, and we produced a working fax, but it wasn't as good as it should have been. I say that. And it was a big investment. Again, we had hoped to sell that as an OEM product, but that didn't work out. And that was probably the biggest disappointment as a product. We also came up with, in the UK, they first had a product called teletext, which was sending out a signal over the television in the blanking portion of the signal. And this is in the days before the internet, really. And this was an idea of giving you all this information that you could display on your TV. And we built a teletext decoder, which we sold in the UK and in Hong Kong being a British colony, but it never went anywhere. And so a lot of effort went into that, along with a follow-up product called View Data, which was a similar product but over the telephone lines. And again, we sold it in the UK and Hong Kong, but a lot of effort and not a lot of sales, but they disappointed me. If I sent myself a note in 75, what would I say? That's a good question. I mean, I guess the first thing I want to do is I tell myself which stocks to buy. And the other thing I would tell myself is don't build a fax machine. That's probably the only thing, that's all I really would do.
All right, so let's talk about Aquarius. Who came up with the idea for checkers originally?
The original concept was Radofin. At the time when we first started developing that, we had a small software team. We were not doing complex products. We were doing some simple games for our programmable Pong type game that used 2K, 4K cartridges. And we contracted with a company by the name of Astec. They made modulators.
Yeah.
They were manufacturers' representatives for a number of companies. They opened up their own software division. And we contracted with them to do the basic software development for the home computer, for checkers, and worked with them initially to do that. So our engineers were defining the system, and Astec was contributing to that design and doing the actual software.
Interesting. And when and how did Mattel enter the picture? You said they actually came to you, but there had to be some level of pitching that happened.
Well, we were building Intellivision for them, and we had their marketing salespeople out visiting us. We had their engineering team out regularly visiting us, and we pitched them. So, we talked to them about the product that we're developing. They were interested in it, and I cannot tell you specifically what they were, but they had some requirements they wanted different than what we were doing, and we had to modify in order to meet their requirements. But that's common in our business line.
Was it always a cartridge-based system from you guys' standpoint, or was that something that Mattel also wanted to?
It was always going to be a cartridge-based system.
And you mentioned that Astec were the primary developers of the SysROM and the pared-down version of BASIC, and then what became the extended BASIC in the Aquarius II. Did you guys choose the Z80 because it was fairly ubiquitous at that point?
It was a low-cost, readily available microprocessor, and there were 3 different sources for it: Zilog, NEC, I believe, and a British, drawing a mental blank as to which company it was in England. Pi, maybe a Philips subsidiary in England was also producing it. Funny story because Mattel was talking huge quantities. And so in the early days, export regulations from the United States, other countries. And so we began conversations with all three of the manufacturers, A, to try to use the three to compete on price, and B, to make sure that we had adequate supplies because Mattel was talking about huge numbers of production for sales. When we approached Zilog to get a license to ship these to China, because that's where we were going to do the assembly, was in China, we had a lot of problems because the US government was afraid that we are going to have Z80 powered MiGs, maybe, I don't know, but they were very reluctant to ship it to China. Even though we were taking delivery in Hong Kong, they knew where they were going for manufacture, and the US government was very, very reluctant. And it took about 9 months before we got an export license. In the UK, through our channels there, we got an export license in about 4 to 5 months to start delivering Zilog to Z80s to China. And NEC from day one is, how many do you want? And we'll ship them to you. And so it was different looking at the three countries and how they approach things.
It's funny because on the Aquarius Plus that we're making, we still use a traditional Z80. We do a lot of the stuff like the two PLAs. You have a Ferranti PLA and you've got a Hitachi PLA in the Aquarius. Those are the two bespoke ones. Those are the ones that, they just don't exist anywhere. So I think at some point those will be ripe for an FPGA replacement. If anybody wants to do that, I would love to see the original drawings for those so we could translate that a little bit easier. And then you do use the TEA 1002, which is used in a lot of systems, which is your television encoder. You guys did some really interesting stuff with it because I think the TEA by itself does PAL, and then you have to kind of trick it into NTSC, or the other way around. I can't remember which.
Probably the other way around, but I'm not sure. Astec was, as I said, a rep, and they repped Hitachi, and so that's why we ended up with a Hitachi chip.
So in terms of the plastics, one of the things that I love most about the Mattel Electronics stuff, certainly the handhelds, and I've got a question about that. What was the general landed price per unit on the handhelds? I imagine that the margin was pretty high. I've kind of spitballed it to saying that, in plastic with stickers, it was probably $2 to $3. Is that too low? Because I know they sold for 30-ish MSRP.
Initially, they were probably, if I remember correctly, Football 2 was in the high 4s, but we drove it down into the 3s.
So then back to the Mattel part. Did you guys design the plastics on the Aquarius, or was that Mattel?
The design was, I think, originally from our industrial designer, modified by Mattel, and then we did the tooling and so forth did the engineering, the drawings, and produced the tools in order to do the plastics molding.
Again, it's just a fantastic design. Even if you don't like the rubber chiclet keys, the plastics on the Aquarius are very, very good. And in general, the whole system is good. I can take any Aquarius, 9 times out of 10, you can plug it in and it's just going to work. Worst case scenarios, I'll have to replace the electrolytic caps, but in general, it works pretty well. And what about the documentation? Because the documentation on the Aquarius, that user's guide that gives you the intro to basic, is pretty special, and you don't really see that these days anymore.
I believe that was written by Mattel.
It's kind of got that hoi polloi look to it, like inserts for the handhelds. So we talked about Astec. There were a number of peripherals that you guys had. 2 of them in particular look like they're Tandys. The color printer, which is the little plotter, and the X11 module look to be units that Tandy did. Was that Radofin? Just happened to, using both of the same parts for different products, or how did those partnerships work out?
There was the printer, the color printer was done by us. And one of the Japanese companies came up with this small color printing mechanism, and we adapted that into the printer for Aquarius. The X whatever module, that was the one peripheral that we did not do. And I do not know where Mattel went to source that.
Back issues of InfoWorld, I see that the Aquarius was mentioned at Comdex in the winter of '83, January of '83. But when was the actual product launch? I've been citing it as Consumer Electronics Show in summer of '83 in Chicago. Is that right, or did it come out earlier?
The official launch might well have been the CES, I would guess that we had mock-ups made for Toy Fair, which would have been February '83.
Obviously, the chiclet keyboard was cost savings. It's much easier to do that than to produce a mechanical keyboard.
We thought that was really a good solution because we couldn't afford the cost of proper keys, and then we're left with alternatives. You could have a membrane keyboard, which is a flat keyboard. It is very difficult. You could use the little punch stainless steel domes that calculators used, but they are not reliable. And when you hit them from different angles, you can get them to double bounce and things like that. And so we came up with the idea of using the rubber keyboard, which gave us a real keyboard at a membrane keyboard price, right?
Well, it's some will call it the wee blue key. Others call it the dead flesh keyboard in terms of
Yeah,
how it feels. But at the end of the day, it does just work. Of the peripherals, so we've got a list of some of the peripherals up here. Everything through the plotter seems like it was out within kind of that magic 4-month window when the Aquarius was officially on sale. Tell us a
yes.
little about the QD disc. And I know that was you guys' product. Is that right? Or you licensed it?
Sorry, what is the QD disc?
So it's a floppy disk it's not your traditional 3.5-inch floppy like we had later on. It was a special disk, and the prototype units that I've seen are pretty big. They're pretty about the size of a Commodore 64. But there was a QDOS, and I guess it had been released for a couple of different systems. I think there was actually a Triton branded one as well too that worked on other systems. It worked on the Dragon, which I think the MSX, which you guys worked on.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't remember a thing about it. So,
That's okay. Aquarius II. Tell us a little bit about that.
well, there was always the intention of coming up with a step up model, and obviously it was going to have a full size keyboard with real keys, but it had to be completely backward compatible. Everything from Aquarius 1 had to work on Aquarius 2. And that established some of the design issues. The additional RAM was put into it, so it was a more powerful computer. And basically, it was a step up, and it was spec to meet a certain retail price. And I'm sorry, I can't remember what the price was,
Okay.
but that's what we were working to. So we had to come up with the next model, the step up, and that's what it was and where it came from, and also be compatible with all the other Aquarius product lines. So you have all the peripherals and so forth existing, so you didn't have to reinvent the wheel.
So these are some questions from the users group. I think I know the answer to this, but why was there only 4K of RAM in the base model?
It would be price related.
And the Aquarius II, it's very, very similar. I think architecturally, it does have that 4K of extended ROM in it for the extended basic, and it does have the mechanical keyboard. Some of the other things that people have assumed that it had aren't really true. It didn't really have a programmable character generator in it. It still used RF out, I believe, at least all the models that I've seen. Uh,
Yes.
were there grander plans? And then again, as you saw the market kind of collapse with the Aquarius One, scaling that back as well too, or was it going to be maybe grander than it was?
Well, I think Aquarius 2 was really just a big brother to Aquarius 1, and it was designed to be that. Then, you'd asked about Aquarius 3. Aquarius 3 never happened. It was a concept. We did have some early discussions with Mattel about it, and when Mattel was still in business, Electronics, and they were all over the place. I mean, it was a step up Aquarius 2 all the way up to a gaming PC. I mean, they were just blue sky discussions taking place without doing any real development work.
About how many Aquarius 2 units do you think were manufactured?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Some people say that it was less than 1,000. Some say that it was more. And the Aquarius 2, was it ever sold in the US or was it only sold in Europe?
Again, I don't remember. I mean,
Okay.
Radofin was an OEM manufacturer. We were not trying to develop our own products to sell under our name. We sold products to a lot of companies. People were surprised that certain products are Radofin built. The Magnavox 3000 was a product that we designed and built for Magnavox. It was the Magnavox video game. And so in order to enter into the computer business, you need to really do a lot of marketing, sales, advertising, And this was not something for a small company like us to do. I mean,
Right.
this was way over our heads. And so when we took back Aquarius, we just made it available to our customers as a product. And some of them did a better job in some countries than others. That's really all I can say. Right? I mean, we would sell it to anyone. We tried to be smart about the way we sold things. And so we sold a given product to one importer, typically in a European country, because they were too small. And if you sold to two importers, they just fought each other on price until they killed it, and then you had a dead product on your hands.
Right.
And so even though on our radios, cassette recorders, etc., the insides were identical, video games, the insides were identical, the plastic housings on the outside were different enough to make them feel like different products.
One person wanted to know if the Aquarius character set, what we call Aquaski, is protected. They want to be able to include it in their game. It's actually a pretty unique character set for just 256 characters, especially since this is a character-only based system. It's pretty remarkable what you can do with that set.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to tell you, I don't think it is, because all the rights to Aquarius reverted to Radofin. Radofin went out of business. The assets were sold to a Chinese company that is also out of business. I doubt that there's any protection on it, but I can't guarantee it, but I suspect very much that it's not.
I know there've been a couple of Aquariuses, again, that you're selling to your customers. We've come across the Akaiko Arabic model, which is really interesting. It's got a 4K ROM in it with a switch on the back. They reuse the channel switch so you can switch between the two. We finally found the editor, which is very clever in terms of how you get the right to left typing in the basic environment. So that's kind of neat. And then, of course, the Italian Kronos Europa model. Were there any other customers that you had that bought these overstock Aquarius units that come to mind other than the couple that we mentioned here?
Not that I can think of.
We're always looking for something new. So here's from InfoWorld in February, right before my birthday in '84. Or actually, probably around the time that I bought the Aquarius, because my birthday is on Valentine's Day. Of course, I got my birthday money, and walking by KB Toys, there's this great bundle right out front for 99 bucks. What do you see as the contributing factors to the crash? I've heard different explanations from people who were in the industry who weren't. I know you probably know Leonard Tramiel. I got to talk to him back in
Yes.
August a little bit about it, and he's got his opinions on it. But what do you see as the contributing factors of the crash?
I think the video game business crashed for a number of reasons. There were a lot of bad games out there, people who were just throwing things together. I think that Atari was the leader, and Atari, I think there were 3 or 4 baseball games for Atari. That was extremely confusing to the buyer who grandma was buying a game for little Johnny, doesn't really understand that this game is better than that game. But then when it gets there, they find out the game really isn't very good. And so you had that going on. I think you also had the issue of making money, profits. A lot of the executives in the video game industry came out of the semiconductor industry. And the concept in the semiconductor industry is that you basically want to buy market share, because once you control the market, then you can control the pricing and make money. In the video game business, that's what was happening. They were trying to get market share. They weren't making a lot of money on the hardware. They were hoping to make money on the software. And unfortunately, they weren't making the money on the software to cover the loss on the hardware kind of thing. And so the business just kind of came toppling down. Now, meanwhile, up in Washington State, you had Nintendo, who was working from a very different perspective and were quite successful at it, right? I mean, they were very rigid. Their games
seems almost like a rise from the ashes, but of course they had developed their hardware in Japan in '83. So
yes.
Nintendo, the NES is a great system. Can you describe in your words the arrangement that Radofin and Mattel came to regarding the Aquarius?
Initially, we contracted with them to design and produce the Aquarius worldwide. We were the manufacturer and the designer, and they were going to buy the product from us and sell it through the Mattel channels worldwide.
And then after the crash, what was the new arrangement that they brought to you?
I mean, this was a shock, and I'll go back and I suppose if I was writing a letter to myself, I would remind myself not to be too heavily involved with one customer. Don't let any one customer take more than X% of your business. Now, I knew that. I tried to work that way, running Radofin Far East, but Mattel kept growing and growing and growing, and so you can't really turn your customer away. And so I tried to manage both, but Mattel was probably about 40% of our business in 83. And then beginning of 84, they pulled the rug out. Basically, my understanding is that the banks told Mattel, you've got two choices. Choice number one is get out of electronics, and choice number two is get out of business. And so it was really a no-brainer for them because their Hot Wheel product line, their Barbie product line were very valuable and very profitable. They just killed electronics. I happened to be visiting Mattel in Los Angeles in Hawthorne on one of the big layoff days that they were laying these people off. As I sat there in the lobby, there were just one after another people who were walking, who were leaving, carrying box. You were issued a box and take your stuff and go.
Probably summer of 83, right? Like August or so. Yeah.
Mattel organized a job conference in one of the local hotels. So they were trying to help their employees find jobs, and people in the area were hiring went in. And I just had this vision. Mattel Electronics by that time was located in a building behind the main building in Hawthorne. And there was a swinging doors coming out into the lobby. And there was a long hall behind the swinging doors that went back and the different departments were. And there was some poor guy, an engineer who was in a wheelchair, and security had put the box on his lap and they just ran him up. And you kind of got the vision. They got to the swinging doors and just gave him a push. That was it. They had no choice. I mean, they really had no choice but to get out of business. We basically were able to take the Aquarius product line. Not necessarily that was something that we wanted to sell, but we had invested a lot of money into it because in the US, it's more common for people to get development money up front. In Asia, this is part of the business. So I'm going to produce a lot of these for you and I'll make my money over time. Tooling, of course, is paid for. If you've got a custom chip, that's paid for. The basic development is amortized into the sale of products. We took it back and did our best to sell what we could to get that money out of it.
The numbers I've heard for Mattel was $394 million loss. That can't all have been Aquarius. Aquarius wasn't the silver bullet that killed Mattel Electronics. There was infinitely more business on the Intellivision side, and to a certain extent, they were still selling handhelds as well too.
That number is huge, and you don't know what it means. It definitely was not Aquarius. And I think a significant part of it was Intellivision. The master component was something that they had poured a lot of money into, but never got it going. All of that will come out in the write-off. The handhelds, I think the handhelds are probably doing okay on. They were profitable for them, even though the prices fell. They didn't cost that much, and so they were profitable for them. So I suspect there wasn't too much of a loss there. Except there is, because when you announce you're going out of business, the buyers, the Walmarts, the Toys R Us, the Kmarts, the KB Toys, are not looking to pay you full price for your products anymore.
They smell the scent of death.
Yes.
How did Radofin make lemonade out of this Aquarius scenario?
At that time frame, you had Sinclair doing a good job with their little handheld computer sort of thing.
Right.
And the low-end consumer electronic market was primed for a home computer. And so we began selling that home computer through the same channels we were selling our video games through and other products. The smaller buyers struggle with it because if you're going to introduce this into, I'm picking a country out of the air, Finland, it's got to have Finnish documentation, although Finns probably all speak English, but you had to put a lot of effort into the translation and so forth. A lot of the smaller importers weren't prepared to do that. So it's only the larger importers that could do it.
How and when did the Aquarius line get off of the books at Radofin? When were you officially done with it?
We produced it into the late 80s, but I can't give you a better date than that.
These are a couple more questions from the group. Is there an archive of Aquarius documentation anywhere, either physical or electronic? We're always looking for any new information sources.
I suspect not. It's just too long ago. It would have been at Radofin, who's no longer in business. Some of the documentation would exist at Astec. Whether they were going to keep it forever, I don't know. And some was at Mattel, but when they got out of electronics business, I think they got out of the business. They just dumped it all.
Kind of the gulag programming exercise that a lot of the Blue Sky Rangers guys had to do, the Night Stalker and a lot of the Intellivision games. I'm sure those intellectual properties are with INTV or whoever the current owner of that is. And then you've got a handful of other properties. You've got your Dungeons and Dragons, which is now with Hasbro, Tron, of course, which is with Disney. But the rest of the stuff, the system itself, would it be safe to say that the Aquarius brand is in the public domain?
I would think so.
Okay. So this is the US trademark ratings. It says that as of November 20th of 1990, the Aquarius name is dead. So that's what we've assumed. We treat it as public domain, and I don't know that anybody would be interested enough to come back and try to revive the brand for any reason.
I don't know who would. At the end of the day, the assets of Radofin were sold to a Chinese company. I don't remember what that contract looked like and specifically what assets were transferred over, but there was more physical assets, but oftentimes the IP goes along with them. But they're not in business anymore either, so
who knows?
Yeah.
In terms of the hardware itself, it's 20 years, so I'm sure it's beyond patent anyway. The only thing that's a little dicey is the Microsoft Basic. Nobody's selling that per se. So tell us about the final years of Radofin.
Well, so first let me go back to the mid-70s. When we made a decision to open our own factory, we took on a partner. There was an English public company by the name of S. Lieboff, then parentheses, Phobel, which is just Lieboff backwards, Limited. And they owned a number of small companies. Acme Electronics in the UK were one of our customers, which is how we first met Lieboff. And they purchased a 51% share in Radofin in 74 and basically financed the establishment of the factory and setting up the business in Hong Kong. We really had very little to do with them. The chairman came out once or twice a year, and I entertained him and told him tomorrow is always going to be better than today. And the OEM business is a very difficult business. It's feast or famine. And sometimes you're making huge profits and sometimes you're struggling. And as I've always said, as long as you make enough profits in the good years, you just tighten your belt and learn how to tighten your belt in the lean years. I mean, you get boom years like Intellivision, and we were shipping in January, February, 81 maybe. We were still air shipping product to the United States. And so we were going crazy. Now, again, from an OEM point of view, I mean, an OEM manufacturer's point of view, a Hong Kong company, our profits are made in 4 months of the year for Christmas. The rest of the year, you don't make a lot of profit, but you hopefully just sort of break even. And when you roll over into January, February, producing a profitable product as fast as you can, it's fantastic. But anyway, they were overall happy with us and left us to run our business. In the late 80s, they were a public company in the UK, listed on the London Stock Exchange. They got into financial difficulties, and their bankers forced the company into receivership. Kind of Chapter 11, but not quite the same. So the majority shareholder of Radofin was a receiver, a trustee. And the manufacturing business, which we're in, is a fairly cash-intensive business in the sense that as a manufacturer, we have to buy the components, bring them in, manufacture the product, and ship it to our customer before we get paid. And so you really are looking at a minimum of 90 days of float, so to speak, of the money. Our business is okay. We had good relationship with our banks in Hong Kong, but as our parent company, 51%, went into receivership, the banks were always concerned that the receiver could pull the plug, could just say, I want you to clean your bank accounts out and send all the money to England. And I could not get them to understand or agree that wasn't going to happen. And I understand. I mean, I don't control the receiver. The receiver is a lawyer in England who could pull the plug. And so they cut back our lending limits multiple times because we were always hoping for something to improve, but it never did. And I even had a situation where my two largest clients were buying components and sending them to us, and we were doing assembly, so we didn't have our money tied up. But that was not a long-term situation. That was short-term. And in 1990, I think, I found a buyer in Hong Kong, late 1990, for Radofin's assets and sold the company. I didn't sell it. The lawyers and receivers and everybody else sold the company. It's too bad because in the late 80s, Radofin was doing very well. We had a very good reputation as an OEM supplier. We were building product for people like General Electric. We were building motherboards for Commodore. We were building all of the door locking electronics and solenoids that went into Jaguar cars for Rockwell, the American company who has a business in the UK selling to the automobile industry. Try and think, Super Mac, we did a lot of business with Super Mac with video boards for the Mac. And so we had a very strong customer base and we're doing quite well, but financing was an issue.
So the geopolitical climate in Hong Kong didn't have much of a factor in it. It was interesting, but not really a contributing factor.
No, not at all. I would say virtually not at all.
Okay.
It's funny you mentioned that because our parent company was British, and so Hong Kong being a British colony, when the British members of Parliament, the British congressmen, came on trips to Hong Kong, the government would set up visits for them, and they very often would come to see Radofin because we were doing high tech, we were doing nice product, and we were British. And I remember at the time we opened our factory in Hong Kong, in the early 80s, having these two members of parliament come in and saw the factory, and I explained to them that I actually had looked all over Asia. We needed to expand. Hong Kong was no longer the place to be making it. It was getting too expensive and labor was short. And I looked all over Asia and ended up going to China. They asked me why, and I told them there were two reasons. One was cost, and the other is supporting infrastructure. Because if you go into a place like India, which was one of the places we looked at, labor was really cheap, but everything had to be imported and it was a problem. So in China, it's just across the border. I can send my engineers in, I can send material in. And they nodded their heads and they said, and what was your political reason? I said, I didn't have a political reason, right? I don't think they ever believed me. And speaking of which, it must have been 83. Princess Anne came to Hong Kong and toured our factory, and I gave her an Aquarius.
Tell us a little bit about your career post Radofin.
Sure. I moved back to the United States at the end of 1990, and it had been a tough few years, and I decided I was going to take some time off and just relax. And money flowed out faster than I'd expected, and I needed a job. And I looked around, and you mentioned Leonard. I had built products for Commodore, and Sam Trammell was Leonard's older brother, was a friend. They needed a VP manufacturing, and he offered me the job in the April-May timeframe, and so I joined Atari.
That was around the time the Jaguar was
Correct.
set to release.
And so Jack Trammell, the chairman of the company,
Oh, yeah.
when I joined, and he set out my job responsibilities, one of which was he wanted to have the Jaguar manufactured in the USA at a competitive price to Asia. I actually was able to manage that because bringing in RAM in those days, semiconductors had no duty. Half of the cost, not quite, but 40% of the cost of Jaguar was in the semiconductors. And so I got it manufactured by IBM in Charlotte, North Carolina. And it did two things for me. One is it gave me a very reliable supplier. And the second is, back in the day, 64K RAM was extremely short. And IBM had lots of allocation. And so I had the RAM. And IBM had a large manufacturing facility in Charlotte, a million square feet or whatever of manufacturing. And they were going out of the business. And so this building was underutilized. And I don't know what his title was. Herb Watkins was the manager of this facility. And he felt if he could successfully sell to a consumer electronic-based company like Atari, he could sell to anybody and provide them the service. And so it worked out well for both of us. So I was able to get Jaguar produced at a competitive price. So it did work.
You said this was 92, 93. This was right before the memory shortage.
Yeah, there was, right in the middle of memory shortage.
That's incredible that you were able to do that. There's been a lot of talk. It's funny the way Jack was with Commodore, and then basically the teams crisscrossed. Everybody at Atari went over to Commodore, and everybody at Commodore went over to an Atari. In some ways, they'll say that the Atari ST was more of a Commodore product than the Amiga was. What was, based on your interactions, you said you knew Sam, what was the difference between 1993 Atari and the one from 10 or 20 years earlier? Obviously, after Nolan left, it was a completely different company culturally, but what's your take on that?
Well, I think that the earlier Atari was part of this crazy video game business that was in the early 80s. Atari was an extremely strong company in terms of brand recognition. I think In terms of brand recognition, they were number 2 or number 3 in the United States after Coke. You know, everyone knew Atari. I think the lack of good games had a big impact on them. But they were the video game industry, the semiconductor guys, cost was not object. They weren't worried about short-term profits. They were going to make it in the long term. Atari, when Jack bought it in, I'm going to say 79, it was around that time frame. I don't know exactly when. They had their office in Sunnyvale on Bregas Avenue. The executives all ate at the executive dining room with a French chef and wine, you know, French wines and so forth. And this was the mentality back then. When Jack took it over, the first thing he did was, I heard, because I wasn't there at the time, filled the warehouse up with Mercedes and BMWs and Volvos that all these people were driving and slowly sold them. So Atari was a very different business. I mean, it was a cost-driven business. I think that there were less risks taken. Probably one of the issues with Jaguar that hurt Jaguar was the lack of software when it was introduced. It was a great system, but to develop good titles in those days, the price had gone up dramatically. I mean, in the early Atari days, 2 kids could knock a game out in a month. You know, I was told that the Sega system games were running $2 to $3 million in development. Oof. They were spending a lot of money. Now, the games were oftentimes very good, graphics, music, etc. But Atari under Jack wasn't going to spend that much money on the games. He wanted to see Jaguar selling first. Atari at that time was like 150 people. That's all it was. Because my last Atari-based job was Jack approached me in November, December, and told me that he was going to be merging with JTS, the disk drive company, and that he wanted to be out of business in 3 months. And the deadline he gave me was 1st of March. And I had to empty the 150,000 square foot Bregas Avenue facility, the big warehouse next to Moffett Field. And on top of that, he said 12 or 13 people is all that should be left. He gave me a couple of names and he said, the rest you figured out who it should be. And but that was the way Jack worked. I mean, when Jack trusted you, he just gave you the job. He was very good at setting the bar just a little bit out of reach. I mean, that was a talent that he had. And so you were always reaching, and you oftentimes got very close, if not making it. But I think I was like 2 or 3 days late, but we did close on the 3rd of March. As I said, he wanted a 2,000 square foot standalone facility for the remaining company. And I found the perfect place because I actually found a small bank that had closed. So I joked with him, I said, Jack, there's a vault for your money in the back. So, and that was the end. I mean, cleaning out that building was just very time consuming. There was a lot of stuff in there. Atari had a sound studio. Atari had, I'd never seen one before because that's not my business, but in the old days, to make newspaper ads, full-page newspaper ads, you had this giant camera that would take pictures for the newspaper ad, and you'd have a negative that was the size of a newspaper, and then they would print from that. Down in the middle of the building inside that no one had ever seen was this giant camera that probably was between the lens and the place where you were taking the picture was probably 10, 12 feet. I mean, in this contraption. I sold the lens. That was the only thing. The rest of the camera wasn't worth much, but the lens was very valuable, apparently. But so it was a interesting challenge. And then I was one of the 6 or 8 lucky or unlucky keepers, and I went over to JTS.
And then Atari stopped being a company and started being a brand.
Well, JTS had no interest in Atari. I mean, if you go to that time frame, Atari had won a major lawsuit against Sega, patent infringement lawsuit. I believe it was like $60, $80 million. I don't know. I do not know what the split was between the lawyers and so forth. That was above my pay grade. But Atari was a company with a lot of millions of dollars in the bank and honestly not much of a product line, Jaguar. JTS was a company with a great idea, the 3-inch drive, which now everyone uses, but then didn't exist, and no money. And so on paper, it was a good marriage. And if I remember correctly, they sold the rights to all the Atari games to Hasbro for like $5 million. JTS, my role at JTS, well, at Atari, I was VP manufacturing. I was in charge of the manufacturing, purchasing, quality, material control, and kind of indirectly responsible for the engineers in the sense that the admin side was my responsibility, not the science development. And at JTS, I actually changed jobs like 3 times in the first 4 or 5 months, but I ended up being VP material. And Tom Mitchell, the CEO, called me in one day and said, "This, you now have a new job. I have split the responsibilities into three: heads and media, PCB, and mechanical components." And I thought, okay, I'll do PCB, so, and he said, "You're going to do heads and media." I looked at him and said, "What are you talking? I know what they are, right?" But he said, "You don't need to do it. That's what, if there's a problem, the engineers will resolve that. Your job is just to keep the parts coming." And he said, "I see your job as being 3 weeks a month in Asia, 1 week a month in the US." Because no one else in the company had Asia experience. And so even though I was responsible for heads and media, I was responsible for electronics and mechanical components as well. But anyway, 3 weeks a month in Asia. And so I think I lived perpetually on Hawaii time, but my body was it was never there. I was on one or the other, so it was extremely hard. But I purchased, in the course of just over a year, I purchased almost $100 million. I issued purchase orders for almost $100 million of heads and media out of my laptop, because he would issue a production schedule and I would just have to get parts to meet that schedule. We never produced at the volumes that were in his schedules, but my job was to make sure we had the parts to produce to it and then to delay the parts. But anyway, it was an interesting job.
So talk a little bit about iLogistix and then Radica, and then how Radica comes full circle and goes back
Yep.
into Mattel.
Okay, well, so I was working at JTS and based in the US. The job was not a great job. And I really wanted to get back to Asia. And I was offered a job by a company called MGA Electronics, take over their Hong Kong office. And I went back to Hong Kong. And January 1st, 88 or 89, I think about that one for a minute. But I had to be in Hong Kong on January 1st. So I showed up and worked there for a year and wasn't really happy, and looked around, and through a friend I was contacted by a company called iLogistix. iLogistix was in the supply chain business. It was a horrible business model, but this is the time when the computer companies were all discovering just in time. And so they wanted just-in-time delivery of components. And iLogistix was a Microsoft authorized supplier. So we were supplying Microsoft, the operating system, on disks in those days. Also manuals. And when you bought a computer in those days, Apple was one of our biggest customers. When you bought a Mac, there was basically two boxes in the outer box. The first box contained the Mac itself, and the inner box contained the software, the keyboard, because different countries have different layouts of keyboard, the power supply, because it was different voltages, and the manuals. So we supplied that inner box to Apple.
Based on whatever localization was needed for the market.
Whatever localization was needed. But the way they worked was, and Apple was perhaps the shortest of just in time, where they had a factory in Singapore. iLogistix had a factory in Singapore, assembly facility, actually just across the border, for the most part, just across the border in Malaysia. But Apple UK, being, from Apple's point of view, worldwide centrally located, would send off the order for tomorrow's production to the factory. The factory would, and this was done by like 3 o'clock in the afternoon Singapore time. The factory would build the printed circuit boards and put the printed circuit boards in to burn in overnight. And they would release, in theory, by 6 o'clock to us, the mix they wanted, 1,000 US, 500 German, 200 French. And then we would deliver those to them 8 o'clock in the morning. And they would take the units out of burn-in, pack them up, and send them to the airport. The trouble is, it really isn't just in time. I mean, it is and isn't, right? From Apple's point of view. But we can't manufacture all that stuff. We can't print the material, make the discs, source the keyboards from Japan and power supplies. And so we ended up stocking that stuff. iLogistix did something like $700 million of sales and made a $3 million profit. That's not a good business model.
No.
iLogistix was pouring money into a software system that would manage all this stuff, so the suppliers, the computer makers, could look and see, and they never got it going. It was a great system in theory, and they put literally millions of dollars into it, but it never came out, which caused iLogistix to head toward bankruptcy. Chapter 9. But again, in Penang at the Dell factory, we would stock the shelves for Dell. One of our employees worked in the Dell warehouse, and then Dell would carry our stuff in their warehouse. And then when they were going to build the German or French or whatever sets, they would call off. We would deliver our box to them. In Dell's case, it was the Microsoft operating system on a disk and printed material. And we would pull it off their shelf and then hand it over to their material control people. At that point in time, we could bill them for it. But interesting business. It actually helped me learn about just in time, and I was able to do some things when I got to Radica but not quite like that. But it was an interesting year and a half. I realized that there was no long-term future there. I could see the company was headed towards Chapter 9. And a friend of mine contacted me and said there was a company in Hong Kong that needed a senior VP operations. And so in early 2000, I joined Radica, based in Hong Kong. It was by far the best job I ever had. It was the nicest people, great job, financially rewarding. It was my best job. And we were, in those days, we were building a lot of handheld games, not only for ourselves under the Radica brand. We also were, I think, Milton Bradley's our competitor, their major supplier of handheld games. Between our games and the Radica and Milton Bradley games, I think we had something like 80% of the Walmart planogram was being made by Radica. And so
when you say handheld, were these cartridges for existing systems or just
no, these were handheld games, handheld poker,
oh, gotcha.
Tetris. These just all the handheld electronic games in the early 90s were very popular. Baseball and football and LCD games. And these were, $9.99 to $14.99 retail and sold in the very large quantities. Also, we had a line of video games that were, trying to remember, there was a brand for it. But they were designed specifically for one game. So your baseball game had a ball that the pitcher would wave and a bat, and you would, you played like that. And so there was hockey and baseball, and I can't remember all the other ones.
And so these were like direct composite in type games.
Yes. And then in 2004, Radica came up with a product based on the old 20 questions called 20Q. And that game won the Game of the Year award given out in the United States by the toy industry. And I think, my notable achievement was, toy business is a funny business. You show your toys in February at Toy Fair. You show mock-ups of them, maybe a working prototype, maybe just a picture. And then the retailers would give you their opinion saying that looks like a good product to me or doesn't look like a good product to me. And based on that, you would go and tool the product up and go into production. And you would produce from about June timeframe until October and fill the shelves up in America. And then Christmas came and was done. The chairman of the company told me 20Q is going to be a great product and you need to be able to produce 2 or 3 million of them over the course of your business cycle. And I said, fine. And we tooled up to do that. But the numbers kept going up. I was able to do some clever things that allowed us to produce the volumes. And we ended up shipping 10 million pieces that year. And that was very good. So to close that, as then in 2006, Mattel bought Radica. So we came full circle there.
So what does a troubled company specialist do?
Mattel bought Radica in October 2006. In 2007, they made pretty much all the senior management offers that we couldn't refuse. And to be fair, they took very good care of us. I don't have any complaints. And so I was no longer working, but I'd never thought about retirement, but all of a sudden I was retired. And I started doing consultant work based with my years' experience working with all sorts of people in Asia, helping people solve problems. The problem might be you need a product manufactured, how to get it manufactured in Asia. The problem might be that you have gotten to bed with a company in Asia that you really didn't understand and shouldn't be in bed with, and how to get you out of the bed so you can stay in business. And so basically that's what I was doing. It was all word of mouth. I really didn't try very hard. People came to me. I helped them to solve problems, and I did consulting for a couple of years, and then I kind of just petered out.
Well, you were a very young president and CEO. You're about I imagine you're born in 46 or so, so you're about my parents' age. You were very young. You don't often see that. I'm happy that you're still around, that we can actually pick your brain on some of this. So,
Yep.
I mentioned this product that we've been working on. We love the Aquarius. And about 2 years ago, I posed a question to a guy who's brilliant. He's from Brussels. His name is Frank van den Hoof, and he's very good at Verilog and programming FPGAs. But we knew from the beginning we wanted it to be open source, so we didn't have to worry about copyrights or anything. We make our PCB Gerber files available to anybody who wants to do it. It's a pretty simple board. We have a governor system. We use an ESP32, which handles all the modern I/O. We still have all the legacy I/O. We have the cartridge ports, those crazy DB9 controllers, and those terrible disk controllers. But we have a pathway forward. Here's a kind of a size comparison of you guys' board for the original Aquarius and ours. Just to pick your brain, what should people who are doing this kind of as a hobby, we can leverage this just-in-time market that you can get a PCB manufactured, fully populated, as long as your bill of materials and your pick and place files are all set up. I can get 50 boards here pretty quickly within a couple of weeks because the number of components on there is pretty small. So will we ever see a day when U.S. manufacturing will have the ability to produce, again, I hate to say the benchmark of $2 PCBs. Is there any way for U.S. manufacturing to reclaim that? Is our future in these high-scale chips that are being manufactured?
I think the answer is that if the product is something that can be highly automated, there is a chance to be competitive building in the US. I think it's going to be a little more expensive, but I think that the supply chain length and so forth can offset some of that. But the components themselves, the plastics and even the printed circuit board, it's just much less expensive to buy them in Asia. So it's a problem.
Even the 3D printing stuff, I can certainly 3D print in my 3D printers here, but even our plastics, like here's a miniature version of it. The resin plastic that I can get from them, I can get insanely quickly, and the quality is very, very good. My daughter says, "Oh, you're promoting sweatshops." I don't know that I am. I think that there are some very skilled people in Guangdong and in a lot of the places that I buy from who seem to be fairly reputable.
Well, there are a lot of reputable companies there, and there are companies that can produce very good quality because all of the stuff that you see made in China that's being sold under household names are being built to specifications. I mean, we were assembling in China the components that go into Jaguar and Range Rover cars.
Yeah, high quality brand.
Yeah.
Are there still government subsidies to keep these prices, like for PCBs, low, or has that ship kind of sailed? And now do they need to manufacture on their own merits?
When you say government subsidies for PCBs, you mean to the Chinese companies?
Yes.
I don't think there were. I mean, the people I dealt with were all private businessmen, and they're not subsidized by the government.
That's kind of what I had thought too, but I had heard that the reason the PCBs are so inexpensive is because the Chinese government's helping them. I don't think that's practical to maintain for very long.
No, I don't think so.
In closing, what would be your top 5 bits of advice to entrepreneurs, people who want to do business globally? Obviously, your specialties in Asia, and then kind of the future of where we're headed with consumer electronics. A lot of the stuff that Radofin manufactured in the 70s were predecessors. I often say that if we didn't have that handheld football game, if the guy who worked for Mattel Electronics, who designed that first racing car game, if he hadn't done that, then we wouldn't have had the Game Boy or any of the other handhelds or even the iPhone. So what are your top 5 bits of advice to this generation of people who want to do interesting things with electronics or toys?
The first one is I always tell my engineers, don't tell me it can't be done. It can be done. Now, it may be very expensive. It may be very time consuming, but it can be done. Now, can we do it? Can we do it competitively? That's another question. But I won't accept it can't be done because today I think we can do almost anything. So if you've got an idea, go for it, try it. I mean, figure it out. I think that still today, the right place to have much of this manufactured is Asia. Be very careful of who you get in bed with. Do your due diligence. Don't just get off the airplane, go to the factory. It is a common business technique in Asia to wine and dine you. And basically, the factory owner will wine and dine you and keep you occupied until you get, from the time you get off the airplane to the time you get back on the airplane. And you think you had a good deal, and you may. I mean, some of those guys are reputable. Some of them are less reputable. But take the time, look around, ask for recommendations, follow up. Make sure you know you're getting in bed with. I did some very good consulting business helping people out of those problems that they got in bed with the wrong partner. What else can I tell you?
You're pretty well educated. You're a big proponent of MBAs and what that can offer. Most good MBA programs will set aside some time as part of the curriculum to send you to Asia to pick up that. Any advice for engineers? I mean, I don't think we have enough engineers, and I don't think we teach enough critical thinking. I often get that question, what's the right school for me? And for engineering, people who you respected and enjoyed working with, where were they coming from?
The people that are doing the design in Asia, most of them were educated locally. A few of them have been to a college in the US, but most of them were educated in Asia. Hong Kong University, the varying Chinese schools, they can teach good design. I think that the entrepreneur side is missing. The coming up with unique things is missing, but they're very good to take and figure out how to make that product work.
Thank you, of course. For anybody who's watching this, here's my contact information. Thank you again for spending time with me to talk through all this. Okay. Thanks, Laury.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.